Hi, I'm Susan Glasser, the editor of Foreign Policy, and I'm talking today with John Lewis Gaddis about his book, George F. Kennan. As you've already heard, Kennan was a diplomat, a scholar, a prize-winning author. The eminent Yale historian John Lewis Gaddis has spent 30 years writing his biography. It's just out in the last few months. He calls Kennan's an American life, a subject we'll be discussing today. We'll talk even more about this 700-page book, one whose grand sweep runs all the way from Princeton on the eve of World War to Stalin's show trials, the devastation of post-war Japan, the intrigues of Dean Acheson's State Department, the bitter politics of Vietnam, and the personal life of a respected, but I think it's fair to say somewhat tormented intellectual. Kennan today, of course, is best remembered as the architect of containment, a phrase that if you Google him will inevitably come up linked with his name. He expressed that, of course, in his famous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs back in 1947. But as Gaddis's book reminds us, he made many other contributions, from practically inventing the serious study of the Soviet Union inside the American government to helping to create the intellectual framework for the Marshall Plan. He was the first, and probably it's fair to say the most accomplished, head of the State Department's policy planning department. Today, still, it's in-house think tank. And when he turned later in life to writing history, he pretty much collected every honor in the field, from the Pulitzer Prize to the National Book Award. He was also, as Gaddis reminds us throughout the book, a lifelong diarist, a perennial depressive at times, a straying husband, a gentleman farmer, a father. At the end of his days, and he did have many of them, Kennan lived till the age of 101 and died in 2005. He was also a sharp critic of what he saw as the misuses of American power, whether it was in Vietnam or Iraq. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let's just jump right in. You call it an American life. In many ways, it's been a part of your life for 3 decades. You sat down and made an arrangement to be the authorized biographer,
That's right. Yep.
George Kennan. This was 1982, right, 81.
Mm-hmm.
And he was already almost 80 years old, so you thought that this was not going to be a lifelong project for you. Tell me what he had in mind for the project and what your original goal was.
Well, I had gotten to know George as a young Cold War historian, which is what I was at the time. And of course, you can't write about the Cold War without writing about George Kennan. And I had met him a couple of times and interviewed him. And I did do a book on containment, on the idea of containment, which came out at about that time. And I showed him draft copies of the portions that dealt with him. And to my astonishment, he loved these. I started getting fan mail from him. And it fairly quickly, because these letters kept coming, it fairly quickly became clear to me that he was angling for a biography. It was a period when New Left revisionism had come to dominate the field of Cold War history, and of course George was very skeptical about that. I was too, and maybe that was the bond between us. But you're absolutely right, Susan. We did agree that it should be posthumous, because we both knew that you can't really write a good biography with the subject looking over your shoulder. But we had no idea that this would take as long as it did.
Well, that's right, 101. But in many ways, what's so striking about Kennan is because of the grand sweep of his life, and of course, it coincided with the entire arc of the Cold War, and even he was around to see the breakup of the Soviet Union, which he had predicted back in the 40s, but of course it took much longer than he expected. So he saw this grand sweep of life, but at the same time it must have been a fairly bittersweet or melancholy, in a way, to watch your legacy. His main policy making years, his main years of political influence were so far removed from the long extended debates and even circular conversation about his work. How did you find him dealing with that?
Well, it really is interesting to think about it, because I was calculating this the other day. He was born 13 years before the Soviet Union was created. He lived for another 13 or 14 years after the Soviet Union collapsed. So his life really did bracket the whole existence of the Soviet Union in that sense. And I think it's fair to say that as far as American foreign policy is concerned, his ideas bracketed that whole period, because it does seem to me that the fundamental idea of containment, which is that you can deal with this adversary without appeasing it on the one hand and without having a war on the other hand, that there was a third way. It seems to me that was the central idea of American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union throughout this period. So part of the paradox and part of the difficulty for me in this book was to explain why, given the fact that his strategy was adopted and was carried through by successive administrations over 45 years, why was he constantly so depressed about it? Why was he constantly so critical of the performance of the United States in world affairs and of his own successors in the policymaking positions?
He does have a tendency, as you document fairly extensively in the book, to personalize foreign policy. For example, as you write, he had a huge fondness for John F. Kennedy, arguably because Kennedy was nice to him, who he went out of his way to solicit his views, whereas, of course, he saw Ronald Reagan really as an anathema. And, so there was always a sense of, there's my ideas about foreign policy, and there's also me in how I think about those ideas.
Certainly was. And that's a great paradox, because Ronald Reagan was actually closer to George Kennan in his thinking about the possibility that the Cold War could end, certainly in his opposition, actually desire for abolition of nuclear weapons. So there were all kinds of correspondences here. But it was a matter both of the fact that Reagan really never consulted Kennan in the way that Kennedy did, but also very much a matter of style, and style was immensely important to George Kennan. So George not only respected, but very much admired Jack Kennedy's style. And Ronald Reagan was a movie star, a television actor. He was a Republican. He was from California. All of these were strikes against him in George's book. So George could never get over what you're talking about here, which is this tendency to personalize what's going on and to see everything that happens really in one way or another as somehow aimed at him or rejecting him or whatnot. He didn't have the capacity for detachment, just for standing back and disengaging, that the survivors in bureaucracies tend to have.
Yes, he was not a survivor in the bureaucracy.
No, he was not.
And in many ways, I think that provoked a lot of his outrage in his writings in his later years, as he continually went back to the theme that his notion about containment had been sort of warped and distorted, that, in a way, some of the hawks inside the bureaucracies, the Polnitzas, if you will, in his view, right, had been very successful in militarizing foreign policy as he saw it. He was terrified of the nuclear arms race. He felt that this was, leading us to the brink of a Holocaust at any moment. And, so you could see that as actually the consequences of personally losing out in these bureaucratic battles, or understanding that Washington wasn't the right place for him.
Well, it's been pointed out in the reviews. I hadn't really thought of this myself, but it's been pointed out that it's a paradox that somebody who was so influential did not really hold any of the highest positions in the American State Department. The highest positions he rose to were ambassadorships to Moscow and to Belgrade, both unsuccessful. And apart from that, that was it, apart from directing the policy planning staff. But part of this was the very difficulty of working with George Kennan. This is what his colleagues felt. Acheson certainly felt this. Nitze, who was a great friend of his for years, but who also felt this. And anybody who ever tried to deal with Kennan within the government found the experience to be very frustrating. And again, it was because of this tendency to personalize things. It was this tendency to be emotional at the same time that you were being brilliant. Kennan lacked the capacity to be brilliant but detached, which I think is a very important quality. He could not do that. And so as a result of this, George himself made it difficult to work with himself in bureaucracies. And so after a while, the word got around that maybe George would be better placed somewhere else. Maybe George should become a professor, in which case none of this wouldn't create any problems.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that really comes through in the book, this notion that he understood himself to be perhaps more honored than consulted.
I think that's a very good way to put it. Yes.
So let's go back
Sure.
to the story a little bit, and you know, I think one of the sort of tensions, right, as a just as a